Good afternoon. I am Valentina Bagnaga, Head of Investor Relations at ThePlatform.finance, the accelerator part of VA Capital, dedicated to alternative investment opportunities. Today, I have the pleasure of having with me Johannes Feist, CEO of the Mikro Kapital Group, and Gianluca Guerra, founder of VA Capital. We are here for a conversation among colleagues about the development of microcredit worldwide. So, Gianluca, would you like to start with the conversation?
Yes, thank you, Valentina, and thank you, Giannis, for your presence here with us. Today, we're going to do a very easy chat to discover a little bit better the opportunity of microcredit in different regions. I have 6 questions for you, and after this question, we can ask to the attendees if they have any other question. So let me start from the beginning. So, Johannes, the first question is about the market overview. Are there areas in the world among the emerging ones where the microcredit market is more concentrated?
Yeah, well, there are several emerging markets where microcredit is particularly concentrated and well developed, and these regions have seen substantial growth in microcredit institutions number and total assets under management, usually due to a combination of several factors: conducive regulatory environments, high demand for financial inclusion, so a lot of work to do still in financial inclusion, but also established networks of microfinance organizations. So if I look at markets with a high concentration or high microfinance development level, certainly South and Southeast Asia need to be mentioned. Primarily, of course, India, with one of the largest microfinance markets globally, with major microfinance institutions, MFIs like SKS Microfinance, now called Bharat Financial Inclusion Limited, Bandhan Bank, and other operators extensively across the country. And here one has to say that the Reserve Bank of India and other relevant regulatory bodies have indeed created a very good supportive market for microfinance. One shouldn't leave out, however, the birthplace of microfinance being Bangladesh, and not leave it out largely because it's here where Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank have been the starting point of microfinance activities across the globe, basically. Other countries in the region with a strong and concentrated microfinance market are, I would say, Cambodia and Vietnam. From a pure asset allocation perspective, and where most of the funding for microfinance, international funding, has gone to over the last years, certainly it's Latin America. And here I'd like to point out Bolivia first, one of the oldest, most sophisticated microfinance sectors in Latin America, with institutions like Banco Sol or Prodem, again building on a conducive regulatory environment, which was conducive for the growth of the sector. Peru could also be mentioned, with institutions like Mi Banco and Edifica leading the market, again supported by good regulatory framework. Now, of course, people speak about microfinance, they often think of Africa, and here the picture is somewhat differentiated. There are countries with a well-developed microfinance sector, like Kenya, for example, with also banks involved in the microfinance sector, like Equity Bank, but also specialized microfinance institution fostering female financial inclusion, like Kenya Women Microfinance Bank. And also the next level of microfinance has been pioneered in Kenya with mobile money platforms like M-Pesa being developed there and having a very prominent role by now. When I would like to look at other countries in Africa with a strong microfinance sector, first I would think of Uganda, where well-known institutions like BRAC, originally from Bangladesh and now active in Uganda, Finca Uganda, or Pride Microfinance are operating again under a good and supportive regulatory and political framework. Could also mention Mozambique, where unlike in many other countries, the regulatory environment also allows microfinance institutions to take deposits, which is a big advantage, not only in their product offering to clients, but also in their refinancing. And now also Tanzania, Nigeria, Ghana should be mentioned. South Africa and Namibia, eventually in the African context, are also strongholds of microfinance, but less so on a role for microfinance in entrepreneurial finance, but more in consumer finance and especially payroll lending, because in both countries the banks are increasingly taking care of the entrepreneurial financial needs. So in each of these cases, substantial development was due to a combination of regulatory framework, demand for financial inclusion, and of course the presence of effective and efficient players in the market. Hope that answers your question broadly.
Yeah, I see. Thank you for this information, because we see a lot of attention for African country during our job as a distributor in the UK of micro capital. So there are a lot of people that are looking for the future of these countries, and they are probably ready to consider this jurisdiction for further investments. Okay. What is the difference between microcredit in Central Asia, Africa, and Europe, based on your experiences?
Well, I'd like to start with Central Asia, because that's where my current strongest experience is. Previously, I've been involved a lot in Africa, but at the moment, our company, our group is focusing on Central Asia, and so I would like to start with this. Central Asia is essentially 5 countries, all of them ending with Stan, and so all the Stan countries except for Pakistan are considered here, and these 5 countries have mixed regulatory environmental frameworks, differentiated regulatory environmental frameworks for microcredit. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan are well developed. In Tajikistan, for example, and that is worth mentioning, there is a regulation for microfinance institutions allowing them to also collect deposits from private individuals, like, as I mentioned, in Mozambique in Africa before. This is extremely important because it can allow MFIs to grow based also on local deposits. To a limited extent, they cannot collect deposits from companies, but from private individuals. But in particular, they can offer deposit services to their clients. This is given in Tajikistan. This was not given in Kyrgyzstan. And so in Kyrgyzstan, a lot of microfinance institutions a few years ago swapped their licenses against small full banking licenses, but nevertheless continued with their activities. So differentiated regulatory conditions, not so well developed in Turkmenistan, and quite well developed also in Uzbekistan. Now, looking at the economic conditions in these countries, strongly in the small business segment relying on agriculture, and the private segment strongly relying on remittances, and in the large corporate activities often strongly relying on mining and extractive industries. So, of course, this is not a clientele, mining and extractive industries, for microfinance. It's a big corporate finance, of course. But around these activities, also mining activities and larger trade activities, of course, there's a lot of small businesses flourishing, and they are again then clientele for microfinance. I would say the cultural context, as everywhere, is influenced by local customs and traditions. Trust and social capital play a significant role, although there's usually no group-based lending in formal terms. Nevertheless, social cohesion among in the villages and within the families is strong, and so informal informal group lending approaches, whereby if one borrower has problems, somebody within the family or the community will be expected to step in, is prevalent. It's actually all types of institutions present there, both from international holdings like Finca or Access, but also we are present in 3 of the 5 countries with microfinance or leasing. Then there's also NGO-based programs which have grown into proper microfinance institution, and also some government-supported programs, especially what concerns female financial inclusion. So all in all, I would say this is a region where a future growth potential for microfinance is clearly given, although the development is already quite good now. Now again, shifting to Africa with its diversity, I mean, it's a bit difficult to speak about Africa in one batch, because it's many countries, all of them are different sort of, and perhaps you can group it a little bit for what concerns the relevance and success of microfinance. As mentioned before, some countries like Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, Mozambique, but even Democratic Republic of Congo have well-developed microfinance sectors, whereas others have not and lack comprehensive oversight. I've already mentioned that South Africa and Namibia, there's a tendency of microfinance to do consumer lending and payroll lending, because SMEs are often served also by the regular banks. What of course always counts in Africa is the economic conditions and the political stability. From an economic perspective, in most countries, still a high level of informality, with large segments of the entrepreneurial population being engaged in either small-scale farming, trading, or other informal businesses, and reaching them is basically the almost exclusive realm of microfinance. Banks don't reach these clientele. African banks, traditional commercial African banks, focus on either crediting larger enterprises or consumers, or, and that's really the biggest challenge, on buying just government bonds. The African banking sector, by average comparison, which is difficult to make across 50 countries, of course, is largely a lazy banking sector, focusing on government lending, buying government bonds, and perhaps doing some lending to larger corporates. So here for Africa, microfinance is absolutely the key for bringing financial inclusion to small, informal entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial people. Success is being stronger or weaker depending on country context. Even more than in Central Asia, cultural norms such as extended family obligations and community support are still even more prevalent. And so in Africa, you do still see the real group lending, where a borrower group is the borrower, and even though only 1 or 2 members of the group are the users of the proceeds, but the whole borrower group feels responsible for servicing the loan. Given the wideness of the continent and the many countries, you see a lot of well-known institutions in some countries, like in Kenya or Nigeria, but you also see, for example, 5 companies of the Finca holding, Finca Microfinance Holding, being active in Africa, in DR Congo, in Malawi, in Tanzania, in Uganda, and Zambia. Then you see the so-called Access banks, not the big Nigerian Access Bank, but the Access Holding Berlin-based microfinance banks in a few countries. Until some years ago, you also had the Microcredit banks in some African countries, but by now they have, Microcredit has stopped banking in Africa because they turned towards more the SME segment and left the microfinance segment. But the former institutions have been bought up by commercial banks there. So a differentiated picture in Africa. Now Europe, That's, I think, an interesting frontier, especially EU Europe. Of course, having a highly regulated financial sector, everything eventually under the same regulatory framework given by the Commission and the ECB or the national regulators. Nevertheless, the EU has specific frameworks and guidelines to support microcredit. This seems to be a bit odd at the first place, but indeed, I would personally say that after years of crisis, first COVID, then war, and other not so promising events, the number of people who might fall out of the classic banking sector, although they are entrepreneurial and might need microfinance to redevelop their businesses, should be growing. So I think that microfinance in Europe clearly is a growth sector.
Yeah,
it's more seen, I would say, it's not so much for poverty alleviation, but rather for social inclusion or social re-inclusion. If you look at people who have operated small businesses and then due to many of the crises, lost their business, lost their banking track record, and now need a fresh start. Or it could be a tool to support specific target group like migrants who found settled in Europe and need to start up their businesses. Yeah, that's Europe.
Technically speaking, what are the difference between the work activities financed in the various countries? So the difference is, I don't know, the size of the loan that you provide different in Africa than in Europe or in Asia?
Yeah. Well, at the moment, we as Mikro Kapital Group or Alternative Fund are not yet active in Africa, but I can tell you that we are currently looking at an opportunity to invest into a microfinance network in Africa. So my comparison is now drawn from current business in Central Asia and previous business of mine before I was with Mikro Kapital in Africa. From the sectors, it's quite similar. Agriculture usually is the leader. Services, often services around agriculture, and services around small industry, and then artisan business is in all of these regions the core activity from a sectoral point of view, plus local trading activities. Usually no activities with cross-border trading involved. The big differences come with loan sizes, where in Africa these do really reach from, let's say, $50 to several thousand, 3, 4, 5,000 US dollar, whereas in Central Asia, it usually starts at the $1,000 to $2,000 range, or maybe $1,000 range, and then going up to 10 or 20 on average, just because businesses are larger, even micro businesses are larger in Central Asia than they are in Africa, for example. Maybe there are some very specific cases in Africa worth mentioning. That is transportation, public transportation, availability of any public transportation is very limited in some regions. So motorcycle taxis or other support in mobility are a special feature of African microfinance, I should say. Again, Europe, as mentioned before, it's not so much about poverty alleviation or financial inclusion per se, but financial re-inclusion of those who dropped out the system. Or it's about social enterprises and eventually, if you take, for example, the case of Italy, which has a very good microfinance legislation, until recently, the upper loan amount for those microfinance institutions was 50,000 euros. Now it's lifted to 70,000 euro. And the main difference between microfinance and banking then is that these microfinance institutions have the advantage that they can get an 80% government guarantee on their portfolio in order to foster the segment, to support the segment. But of course, that's clearly above whatever you see in Africa or even in Central Asia.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Next question. It's a little bit personal, probably. Do you remember any particular episode typical of certain emerging countries regarding success achieved through micro capital financing?
Interesting. Yeah, I think there's two examples I'd like to talk about. One is also relates to my home country, which is Germany. We have a very successful woman entrepreneur in Romania, and actually she operates, and that sounds a bit crazy, maybe she operates 9 kindergartens by now. And how did this start? She was on a trip to Germany with her 2 kids, visiting her relatives. And as you know, there's a lot of Romanian community in Germany, as you probably know. And she noted the kindergarten concept, where in particular, single parents can have their children taken care of during the day and during the morning and to the early afternoon and go to work instead. And when she saw that concept, which also involves preschooling and really social care and group building and very good stuff, and my son was at kindergarten as well, benefited from it. And she noted that in Iași, the city in Romania where she lives and where the headquarters of our Mikro Kapital Romania actually is, it didn't exist there. And so she decided to open up the first kindergarten in Iași of that type herself, based on a loan to buy and import equipment. So kind of a fixed asset loan from our Mikro Kapital Romania. And then she started working this, and the kindergarten, of course, parents have to pay, but it's a success story. And then with 3 more loans, she opened more kindergartens and operates them now in Romania. But today, she, I think, is kind of the owner or operator of 9 of these kindergartens. The second example, which I want to give you, starts a bit of at a sad starting point. It's about a family from Kyrgyzstan. The father, due to lack of higher education, had no chance basically to get a good opportunity job in his country, and moved him and his family to Armenia, where he worked as a construction worker, and the wife worked as a waitress. But they faced troubles in getting permanent work permits, official permissions to live in there. And then finally they decided to go home. So their first venture into improving their living conditions being to move abroad, to try to build up an existence in another country of the so-called former Soviet Union, where they thought that cultural affinity would be great and fine. They failed on that. So they had to go home, back to Kyrgyzstan, and he started selling small horned cattle at the market, and still continue to work part-time on a construction site. But on that second business, the demand grew, and so he decided to buy the necessary tools to offer his services as an independent constructor, taking a loan from our on there. And additionally, working as an independent contractor, of course, he needed transport. He needed to offer his services not just in the area where he could walk to, but needed a van. And he financed this van from our company Mikro Leasing, and it took only 3 days until he became owner of that van. And with this van, he increasingly could offer his services, also driving there, transporting his material, and to basically reduce his expenses, because he didn't have to lease a car on a daily basis or organize transport with a taxi or whatsoever. Being successful then in the construction sphere, but also understanding what mobility means, he also started providing taxi services, which gave him additional income. So by and large, from being a small-scale farmer with the ability to do good work as a construction expert, he has built up a small enterprise of consisting of offering construction services, offering mobility, offering transport services between the villages and the nearby city. And so a real little successful entrepreneurial career after a kind of failure in Armenia.
This is the magic of microcredit, because every time that you discover the real story behind the asset class, behind the loans,
Yes,
you can feel the real economy, right? It's
yeah.
it's not only finance, but it's finance linked, direct link to the real economy.
Yes, and it's driven by the real economy. It's finance as a service and not finance as a means of its own.
Yeah, it's true. So, next question. What are the main drivers that lead you and the company to consider entering a new country? So, for example, economics value, cultural value, or what else?
There's a theory to it and there's a practice to it. The practice to it so far is that our company, Mikro Kapital, from its people, from its DNA, from its history, is specialized on the markets of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which have a lot of commonalities and a lot of linkages with each other. So the natural next step after, say, having established in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan was to establish in Kazakhstan as well, this time with car sharing. And one could consider being established in Armenia to establish also in Georgia. So you usually stay with the things that you're good at, but at one point in time, there's certainly a point where you see that you can deliver your experiences made mainly in Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, also to other regions of the world where you see opportunities. And then, of course, you apply criteria like how are the cultural values in that place where you go? Who are the partners there with whom you work? How is government stability? How is potential economic outlook? But most of all, where is still a big demand for microfinance? Because let's not be mistaken, if we go into a country where the demand for microfinance is already served by others, we are neither needed nor will we be very successful. And actually, in a way, our planned expansion into some African markets seems to belie all these theses. But here, it's really that we have found a very good partner whom we want to work to. So in the end, it's a mixture of opportunistic search for good markets, good partners, always keeping in mind your own abilities. But most and foremost of all, we're looking for places where we can make a difference. Yeah. Otherwise, we won't be needed there.
So finally, last question from my side. Probably one of the hot topic of the moment, because now let's talk about the sustainable aspect. Okay. One of the most important concepts is certainly the sustainable aspect. Has it influenced your choice to expand in some countries rather than others?
That's an interesting question. Everybody's talking
I told you
about...
it's not topic.
Sorry?
I told you it's not topic. So it's...
Everybody's speaking about sustainability, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, environmental finance. And people tend to forget that poverty alleviation and creation of suitable work, labor, and income is at the basis of sustainability. So I would say the first level sustainability goal always remains poverty alleviation and allowing people to develop out of poverty, provided these people have the ambition and the energy. So it's not social support, it's allowing entrepreneurial people to work themselves out of poverty. And that's the basis for sustainability. And now, in that sense, I would say micro sustainability is not the selection metrics for our activities, but it's the output of our activities at the first level. And then at the second level, when I speak about our business in conferences or forum, I'm often asked, are you financing climate change mitigation and adaptation? Do you have special programs for this? I say, no special programs. But our clients increasingly need financing for climate change adaptation because they're farmers and they see the problems of droughts. They see the problems of the needs for irrigation. They see the needs for using water in a reasonable and scarce manner. And so they design our adaptation finance programs by asking us to finance intelligent irrigation systems, or to finance new seeds which allow them to plant crops which are less vulnerable to climate change. Similar goes for climate change mitigation. Our clients increasingly ask us to finance for them solar panels on their rooftops because they don't want to bear the cost of energy. So in a nutshell, what we're doing, I think, contributes to sustainability from the outset, as it's poverty alleviating. We are not designing special programs for energy efficiency, renewable energy, or adaptation, but we react to the growing needs of our clients to do exactly that. So we are a sustainable financier reacting to our clients' demands for sustainable finance.
This is very interesting. You flip the point of view on the sustainability. That's really interesting. So, okay, Valentina, do you have any question from the listener of the webinar?
So yes, I got a few questions from the audience. So if you want, I can read it and then we can answer. So first question, Johannes, what are the default rates on your loans in these regions of the world? It's commonly believed that emerging markets equate to counterparty risk. Can you provide some data on this?
You mean on the credit default rate?
Yes.
The so-called portfolio at risk, more than 30 days. So loans which are in arrears with a payment or more payments for more than 30 days. In our companies, we have 11 companies at the moment, usually is not higher than 5%. In most of them, it's a bit lower than 5%. Occasionally, in one company, we might have outrunners with 8-9%. If there is a specific situation in the country, like we're strongly focused on agricultural lending, and if there's a drought somewhere, like we have it at the moment in Moldova, certain parts of the country, certain parts of the borrower clientele cannot repay. So this default rate, and it's not yet a default rate, it's just a risk rate, increases, and we have to do restructuring of some loans. The level of write-off, so loans which we eventually have to write off, is less than 1%. This might be a bit astonishing to some, but microfinance actually is a very secure business model. Mainly, I would say, because our clients, first of all, of course, they want to repay, but also they know that if they don't repay, they have a few alternatives only where to go. So for them, retaining a good relation is very important. And then if we have problems with a repayment by a borrower, if we have collateral, and usually we have collateral, we would not be aggressive and sell the collateral, but we would rather allow the borrower to sell the collateral himself, because then he can better negotiate, he can get a higher price, he can repay the loan, he can keep the rest and start again. For us, a defaulting client is not necessarily a bad client. It can also be a troubled client. And if we jointly manage to get the troubled client out of trouble, we both make good business again in the future.
Thank you. That was very insightful. So let's see, we have a second question. When you identify a new country to develop your business in, how do you analyze the various risks and opportunities in that country?
Mm, except for our focus on the, let's say, the bridge from Central Eastern Europe via Central Asia to Asia, which before this notion became politically a bit troubled, was called the Silk Road. Now it's a bit difficult. Except for that specific region, we are not looking so much at other regions per se, but we're rather opportunistically driven by finding the right combination of partners, of situations. And so our forthcoming move to Africa was long planned, but the actual design of that move, which I cannot give yet in detail because it's not underwritten yet, the actual design of that move is then based on a group of partners we found and whom we want to work with. It could have been partners in other African countries, but it is now partners in a certain group of African countries. But that was really a mixture of we want to go to Africa and we needed the right partners.
Thank you. And last question, is it true that Mikro Kapital manages the entire process from capital raising to loan disbursement and collateral definition?
Yes and no. You must think of Mikro Kapital Group as, on the basis, it's a securitization vehicle which owns the assets, owns the equity in these microfinance banks and leasing companies, and also provides some debt financing to them, to these companies, 11 companies all in all. At the same time, these companies also borrow on their local markets. So the balance sheet of these companies is composed of our equity, our debt, and external debt. They all follow a synergetic approach. They have similar policies. They learn from each other for what concerns lending decisions, collateral valuation. But it's not that my management team in Luxembourg decides on each and every loan or each and every collateral. These are 11 legally independent institutions who take their decisions based on very similar and mutual learning-based policies and procedures and standards. Our group control is inserted over these companies on the one hand by being the owner or the majority owner, which as a shareholder gives you certain rights, but also I and my colleagues sit on the boards, supervisory boards of these companies. So I sit on 4 supervisory boards, our chief risk officer sits on 3, and so forth. But in essence, these are legally independent companies who have in common that they have to take their own decisions, but these decisions on lending and collateral are taken according to common standards. And they are in a group, and so they benefit from each other's experiences. On the funding side, yes, we do it. We do it as well. So we have a sales network which reaches out to the market and issues bonds for us, or makes us issue bonds. And with these bonds, we refinance a significant chunk of our company's liability side. So it is all in one, but with differentiated roles. Thank God I'm not the boss of around 3,000 people. I'm just the boss of around 40 people because I'm just the holding level.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Gianluca, would you like to add something more?
Well, for me, everything is fine. All these insights are really useful for our work as distributor. So I want to say a special thanks to Johannes for this conversation.
Special thanks to both of you for the opportunity.
So thank you again, Johannes and Gianluca, for your time and for your explanations. And thanks to all the attendees for the participation. You can join the platform for free and get access to all our content and research on microcredit and micro capital. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.